We're done with the small wings. We're going to start on the big wings. And then the thing that we need to pay attention to here is the direction that we're going to start the stitches. And if we start the stitches in the wrong direction, it's going to be a problem that the big wings are going to be knitted the wrong way. So let's look at it. Let's look at the small wings to the right-hand side. And let's look at the big wings to the left. And let's see that this tentacle determines the direction of the stitches. So let's go in this direction, and let's go to this direction. The starting point is not here, but here, in the center, where the last row is differentiated. The 7th row is differentiated, where the big wing and the small wing are divided. And we're going to enter the needle and crochet here. And then we're going to start the wiring in the center, put it in the back, hook the needle and wrap it around, and then squeeze the thread behind the back, wrap it around and bring it out, and start the 3 locking stitches. And if you're a beginner, you can mark the first stitch, the 3rd locking stitch, and then you'll be ready to go, and then you'll be ready to go, and then you're ready to go. Then knit another long stitch in the same place. As we're knitting, we're hiding our stitches, and we can hide our stitches a little bit, and on the 2nd stitch, we're still knitting a long extra stitch. To hide the thread is to put the thread on top of the crochet hook, so that when we wrap the thread around it, it's hidden in the texture of the fabric. And once it's hidden, you can cut it, you can cut the thread, and then once the rest of this is done, we're going to knit 2 locking stitches as a spacer, and then we're going to start on the middle of the big wing. And this is where you're going to start knitting the pattern of knitting the first stitch, and then you're going to knit the first stitch, and then you're going to knit the 2nd stitch. Crochet a long needle with extra stitches. When you're done with this long stitch, the center part, except for the last stitch, in the middle section, knit all long stitches without adding or subtracting any stitches to the corresponding gauge. In the middle section, after we've knit the long stitches one by one, in the last stitch, we'll still have 1 long plus stitch. That is, in the last stitch, we'll knit 2 long stitches, 2 locking stitches as a spacer. And in the last section, we'll still have 2 long plus stitches. And in the last section, we'll have 2 long plus stitches. And in the last stitch, we'll have 2 long plus stitches. Next, flip the tabs. Extradition is a place I won't repeat. Here it is the same as saying that in the beginning it was also 2 long stitches plus the needle, because they're all the same. Look. The 2 locking pins serve as spacers. Then the next same, at first the first stitch is still long plus. The center part is a long stitch without adding or subtracting, and the last stitch is a long stitch with a needle. In the middle, crochet 1 long stitch in each pattern. I'm not going to show you all the repetitions. When we're done with the center section, we'll move on to the last stitch and we'll knit a long extra stitch. After the long stitches are added, there's 2 locking stitches spaced apart, and then this last part. 2 long stitches plus needle. We're done with the 9th row, because this place divides this row. It's the 7th, 8th, and 9th rows. Then let's move on to the 10th row. Flip the tabs. Extradition, 3 locking pins, and this first part is a repeat. Two locking pin spacing. Just start the first stitch, and in the middle, this part is still a long overstitch. Knit a long stitch with extra stitches. The next step is a repeat of the long stitch without adding or subtracting anything. I'm not going to show you how to do it all, but just knit the stitches according to the gauge. In the last stitch, you'll also be knitting a long overlock stitch. 2 locking pins as spacers. The last part, 2 long stitches and a needle. Next is the 11th row of the flip weave piece. The 11th row is crocheted in the same pattern as the 10th row, with long stitches on top of the first. Long stitches in the center that don't add or subtract. Just knit the corresponding stitches. With the center knit, we're still knitting the long extra stitch in the last stitch. 2 locking pins as spaces. And then on this last part, we'll knit 2 long stitches plus 1, so that's the 11th row. Nine, 10, 11. 8, 9, 10, 11, 11 rows of knitting to finish. When we started knitting the 12 rows, we had a change here. Look at this. Flips the web over. The first part of this place is the same as extradition, except that when we get to this place, we need to keep extraditing. That is, keep hooking the pull-out stitches. And then crochet 2 pull-out stitches here, including in this eyelet. Then we'll go to the first stitch and we'll knit a pull-out stitch and then another pull-out stitch. That is, when we've pulled up to the top of the second stitch in this center section, we'll begin to crochet 3 locking stitches for the first stitch. In this place, the beginner must make a marking button if you forget to do the previous one. It's okay. This place, we must make a marking button as a marking mark. Next, this stitch will not be knitted again to the next stitch. Knit the long stitch first, corresponding to the long stitch one by one, or the same as the previous one until the last stitch in the middle. We will knit the extra stitch of the long stitch, 2 locking stitches as the spacing, and the last part, the long stitch, the long stitch, the extra 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 stitch. Extra long stitches. This area is actually on the tentacle side, so if you're experienced, you can look in this direction and flip the weave. Start the 13th row, or extradite twice. Then knit 2 sets of long stitches plus stitches at the beginning. Includes 2 locking pin spaces. On the first stitch, knitting long stitches with extra stitches. But this place, the middle one is not added or subtracted to continue crocheting, but not crocheting to the end. Let's start by knitting a long stitch that corresponds to the gauge. In the middle, we need to knit 25 long stitches. without adding or subtracting 25, because it's not easy to count. It's just a matter of counting. Then we'll look at this side, which means that when there are 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 stitches left and 5 stitches left, we won't knit anymore. Which means that when we're knitting in the 13th row and there are still 5 stitches left, we won't knit anymore. Next, we'll turn the piece over and we'll weave the 14th row, and for the 14th row, we'll start by pulling. Move this crochet position to the 6th stitch, leaving the first stitch unhooked, and draw on the second. 3. Third stitch, 4th stitch. The 5th stitch, the 6th stitch. After we've extradited over the 6th stitch, we'll begin to crochet the 3 locking stitches. Put a marker button here. Next, one by one, knitting long needles. All the way to the last stitch of this section, we're knitting a long extra stitch, which means that this side remains the same. That is, the antennae side remains the same. But this is the only place where we need to make a change. The direction should be clear. The last stitch in this part of the 14th row, let's just keep knitting. Addition of long needles. 2 locking pins as spacers. This last part is the addition of 2 long stitches. The big wing said, one side stays the same, the other side changes. So let's flip it over and start knitting the 15th row. Just follow the same pattern as before.
Next, on the first stitch, again, we'll start with a long plus stitch, and then we'll start with a long plus or minus stitch, and then we'll start with a long plus or minus stitch.
Here are 14 of them. 14 long stitches that don't add or subtract. I'm not going to show you everything. After these 14 long knits, no increases, no decreases, we're down to 6 stitches. And look, the stitch we're marking is the first one, and it's the first one we're marking. 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and if we don't want to count in the middle, then we'll just count the last 6 that aren't knitted. Remove this marker. To flip the tabs, turn the knitting piece. Here is still extraditing 6 stitches. That first one is not knitted, first empty, but it counts. Twand. Third. Fourth. Fifth. Sixth. On the 6th stitch, start with 3 locking stitches to represent the first stitch. Next, knit the long stitches to the long stitches. When you get to the last one, remember to knit the extra long stitch. I won't repeat myself. Last stitch. Addition of long needles. 2 locking pins as spacers. And 2 long stitches plus needle. Then turn the piece over. Start the 17th row. Crochet this side in the same direction as the previous one. Still 2 long stitches to start with. Two locking pins as spacers.